course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Betrayal of right. Feel my wrath. Certainly. For my father and king. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For order. Betrayal of right.
不要打我。哎，冲动了！哎，完蛋了，准备砍到，刚才以为砍到了。他怎么会孙权？
Certainly. Of course. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. The light is strength. Our allies' town is under siege. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
土龙甘霖。哎，我这 W 可以刮到那个吗？手杖吗？ 你这边还没有。
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Our allies' town is under siege. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
哎，可以。
A sound
不行，刮不到。
Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father, the king. A sound
拆掉了。
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. You are past redemption. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
哈哈，又踢到了，赚了、啊。
For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
没中。
Sound. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Our allies' town is under siege. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. For honor. Certainly. Our allies' town is under siege. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Betrayal of light. A sound plan. Of course. For my father. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. You are past redemption.
干
Certainly.
踢不到。
Of course. For my father the king. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Betrayer of light. Justice is good. You are past redemption. For honor. Betrayer of light. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A
这种是控老虎控到自己死掉吗？
Our allies' town is under siege. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. For my father the king. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A
哎
sound，
看
plan. Our allies' town is under siege. Certainly.
，shit，
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
这塔我们就不要了，
For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
反正塔被拆无所谓。
I
这
stand
塔里赚
for
吧。
the light. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For our allies' town is under siege. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Justice is come. Certainly. For
靠
honor.
背，
Certainly.
那怪怪的，
A sound plan. Our allies' town is under siege.
冲到了靠
A
背，
sound plan. For
不要
honor.
忘记。
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Our allies' hero has fallen. Of course. A sound plan. Our allies' town is under siege. Of course. Our allies' hero has fallen. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Justice. Our allies' town is under siege. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For
一个走
honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Our allies' town is under siege. Certainly. sound plan for honor. Of course. A sound
下路 hold 住吗？
for honor. Certainly.
他没有爪环，
I stand for the light.
没有爪环不太好去。不过两个都有活死，
Shall be done.
好像还好。
Of course. A sound. Of course. You are past. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. Prayer of light for my father the king. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
不要，
A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our allies'
For
hero
honor.
has allies'
Is there
town
danger?
is under siege.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound
要
plan.
这样冲出去。
Certainly. I stand for the light. Is there danger? A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Feel my wrath. For Lord Aron. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Bow.
看完了，
Justice is come. For Lord Aron. Betrayer of the light.
哦，好险，是吗？糟了，刚想要拉了，来不及拉了。
A sound.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound.
我的嘎子，
For honor. Of course. A sound. Certainly. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Justice is come. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. Of
Madam.
course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
哎呦，震的好，震的好，震的好。
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. You are past redemption. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
哇哦哇哦哇哦哇哦哇哦！想走是不是？
Of course. Certainly. Of course.
这助网怎么用老虎在赚钱？哇！
Feel my wrath. For honor. You are past. A sound plan. Of course.
开始把第二道点满了。
Certainly. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. Certainly. For honor.
Our allies' town is under siege.
The light is my strength. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For Lord Aron. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. course, a sound plan. Of course, a sound plan. For honor. Of course, for honor. Certainly, for honor. Foul name. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
这朱总到底在哪里？看不到他人。
Plan. Certainly, a sound plan. Of course, a sound plan. For honor. Of course, for honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. Certainly. For honor.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Feel my wrath. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Our allies' town is under siege.
I stand
上路在推了，我赶快回去。
here to help.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done.
Our allies' town is under
Is there
siege.
danger? Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course.
结果他们不推了。
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For my father, the king. You are past death. A sound plan. Justice. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father, the king.
他应该没大。
Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound. Of course. A sound. For honor. Certainly. Foul name.
哎，
A sound plan. Certainly.
哟，
Of course.
差一点点，差一点点。
Certainly.
好险有没有霸王斧？
For honor. Of course. Certainly. A
那个
sound.
云掌怎么那么远就发动了？
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound
Our allies' hero has
plan. Of
fallen.
course. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
小心哦！
Stand. Of course.
不知道有没有晕上，先让小兵过去。
Of course. A sound plan.
哦，真的有晕上。
My wrath. Betrayer
不没关系，反正小兵过来了。
past death.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. sound plan.
所以马招是肥的，
A
有
sound
雷甲之后应该好赚钱。他再一个魂枪应该就
for the light.
很好抓了。
For honor. Certainly. A sound
Allies hero has fallen. Allies hero has fallen.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. The light is my strength.
现在不能救你哦，
A sound plan. For honor.
他跑掉，他跑掉了。
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Our
A sound
allies'
plan.
town is under siege.
Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course.
Betrayal of light.
For honor. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. You are past redemption. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Betrayal of light.
A sound plan. For my father.
Allies hero has fallen. Allies hero has fallen. Allies hero has fallen.
把这王砍掉了。
Fallen.
伤害不够啊，反正这种砍很多下。
I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
没有，都是车耶。
Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Betrayal of light.
For honor. Certainly. Of course, certainly. For honor, a sound plan. Certainly. For honor, a sound plan.
然后他们如果过来的话，我们再 all in。那那边的话，有很多晕障看不到，就没办法了。
Of course, a sound plan. Of course, a sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly.
我们前差一点。
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For my father. Of course. For honor.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. Justice.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor.
You are past death. Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan.
Our
Cool.
allies' town is under
Of
siege.
course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father and king. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor. Certainly. You are past. Feel my wrath. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
让他去赚吧。
A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
哎，这是要出什么？
The light is my strength. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. You are past. For Lord Oran. Certainly.
靠，没他大绝啦，靠北啦，干，刚不是按的吗？哦 ，fuck， 我好累哦。
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For my father and king. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. You are past death. For my
打那么久，
course. Prayer of light. Feel my wrath. For honor. A sound. Our forces are under attack. A sound. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. I stand for
啊
the，
我很犹豫，我下一家要出什么，
light. The light is my strength.
非常之犹豫呢。
I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. What does the shadow for honor? Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound. Of course. A sound. Certainly. A sound. You are past death. Certainly. Betrayer of the light. For Lord, you are past death. Our allies in the house.
哎，你怎么往后退？
For Lord Aron. Of course. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. A sound. Certainly. A sound. Our allied town is under siege. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. The light is my strength. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
哇哇哇，还在追，还在追！张飞来了，哎呀！要不要先打掉那个营长？张飞，好紧绷哎！
Of course. For my father the king. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A
双
sound
霸王
plan.
封神，
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound
这种也是很勤劳，一直要用老虎来赚钱。
For honor. Of course. Certainly.
这边没打到。
Of course. Certainly. For honor. You are master. Our allied town is under siege. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Justice has come. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Betrayer of the light. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
买一下吧。
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Our allied town is under siege. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Betrayer of the light. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
靠腰嘞。啊，还好。还有他们这边还是打掉了。我刚刚这波走在前面，3军营。哇，这波
I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly.
啊，一个火爆的掉，这样好亏了。哦，没关系，它加倍了，现在可以开始存那个兵的钱。他们就买装吧，我应该可以存很多钱去喊兵。哎呦，这边怎么了？真假？哇，空，没有视野，可惜。
Of course, certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
西咬料内，
For honor. Of course. For
这样
honor.
看吧。
Certainly. Of course. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. You are past redemption. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. The light and strength. Is there danger? I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Feel my wrath. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Foul name. Certainly. Feel my wrath. For honor.
Our allied hero has fallen.
这种还在喷，好痛！
I stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Foul. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. Justice has come. Feel my wrath.
Allied hero has
A sound plan.
allied hero has fallen.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Foul. Certainly. For honor. For my father's king. Certainly. A sound plan.
带上路兵，
Of course. Is there danger? For honor.
法阵很快没了，
Of course.
等法阵龙没了就打进去了。
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. You are past redemption. Justice shall be done. Betrayer of the light. Justice has come. For honor. Certainly. Feel my wrath. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For
他们
honor.
兵是真的很多
A，sound plan.
喊不完的。
Certainly. For honor. The light.
就我们刚喊了超多兵的，
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For loyalty. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
耶、
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Betrayer of the night. Found. You are back. For my father.
我们是完全打不死。
I stand for the light.